Welcome back to Sunday evening devotions. Well, tonight we want to look at the story of Moses and the 10 plagues as Moses deals with Pharaoh as God's mediator sent to Egypt on behalf of his people in Exodus chapters 5 through 11. As we've seen, the book of Exodus isn't so much a story about the Israelites gaining their freedom as it is a deliverance from sin, slavery to sin, the exodus of God's people from the world into a covenant relationship with God. As God had made covenant with Abraham, he was going to make a covenant with the nation. So Moses was sent as the mediator of this new covenant. As he returns, he faces Pharaoh. You may recall that Moses has the staff and Aaron is his prophet, and the staff is thrown down before Pharaoh as proof of his power, of God sending him, and the magicians copy that action and their staffs become serpents. And this is a reoccurring theme for a couple of events here, that the Egyptians can, in a sense, copy God's miracles. Certainly, Satan is an angel of light. He can do certain things, but his power is limited. When we get to the third plague, after the turning of the water of the river Nile into blood, the frogs, and then the gnats that come out, and the fleas, is at that point that the Egyptians cannot replicate the miracles of God. And in those first three plagues that God performs upon Egypt, against Egypt, Israel suffers as well, because there's a lesson there. We have to deal with our sin. God is in with our sin, that we are deserving of death and destruction as God's people. The Israelites were sinners also, and they needed to be called to repentance. Remember, they had a lack of faith in the mediator. When Moses came and Pharaoh made their lives hard with labor and increased the demands upon them and took away the straw for the bricks, they didn't have the faith. And when God's people are oppressed and we don't see it, we don't live by faith, we often fail. And so the people failed. But God is gracious, you see. And so beginning then with the next plague, the plague of the flies, Israel is separated from what Egypt suffers. And God singles them out and protects them as his mediator Moses stays with them through the trials. And so God then performs his work, as we're told that God had raised up Pharaoh to display his glory in him. He was going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And so Pharaoh relents and then hardens his heart. And so plague after plague falls upon Egypt. And the magicians and all the people are humbled before the Lord's power. Throughout this whole event, what the demand is that Pharaoh is to let the people of Israel go that they might worship the Lord in the wilderness. Pharaoh tries to make conditions upon that demand. First he laughs it off, and then he tries to make conditions. And really what this story is about is, again, that God's people belong to God, not to any earthly power. That God's people ought to be and will be free to worship him as God requires. And that human nations and kings and rulers cannot limit that and cannot control that, cannot condition it. And if they do, they're fighting against God. But we see those same things today, even in our day of pandemics and regulations. We've seen it in the history of nations in the past. And God wins in the end. There is suffering in the process. But here God is teaching Pharaoh an important lesson and teaching us that we as believers belong to God first. We are his people. And so again, Pharaoh tries to limit it, but Moses says, no, this is what God is requiring of you. And so when you see that passage where the demand is simply for the people to go and to be free to worship, that's really what this is about. God's people don't worship Pharaoh, they worship the Lord. Pharaoh thought they belonged to him. God's people belong to God. So this battle rages all the way through, and you get to the 9th plague and the darkness, and Pharaoh has had enough, and he warns Moses in his anger that if he sees his face again, he and Aaron, they will surely die. Moses says, well, you have said it. And it is at that point that the strength and the power of Pharaoh is broken, and we see the brokenness of human ability, because God then decrees the death of the firstborn across the land. And again, Israel is spared. Why is this? Well, because you see, it is the promise again of the seed to come, that God will bring about the Christ. It is the reminder that the strength of humanity is broken, that sin has corrupted everything, that all of us are deserving of death. But God is gracious, and He's calling and making a people for Himself. And as Moses was the mediator of that covenant, he was a picture of the mediator to come, Jesus, of a mediator of a better covenant. And He comes. And He comes to deliver His people from the effects and bondage of sin, and reminds us that we have a hope in Him. Well, that's good news. Good night.